Listeners, welcome to today's online session. Today I'm going to talk about contemporary Canadian poetry and its characteristics. In my previous lecture, I talked about various characteristics of poetry. I talked about the various forms of poetry. I talked about beginning part, Confederation poetry. I talked about modern poetry. So today I'm going to talk about contemporary Canadian poetry. If you look at my objectives, today's objectives obviously is to introduce all the readers to contemporary Canadian poetry, and not only to the Canadian poetry, but also to its characteristics of Canadian poetry, contemporary Canadian poetry. Now, when you look at this background of Canadian contemporary poetry, see, Canadian poetry shows an extraordinary continuity throughout the 20th century, and if some poets of the early decades had a feeble like voice, okay, others like AJM, we had Smith, okay, he's another right, okay, poet, AJ Pratt, okay, these are the poets, who assured the flow of the vital current which was going on during that time, okay. So what we witness is that, there has been an extraordinary continuity amongst the poets regarding the thematic concerns of their poetry, and the unbroken continuity and brilliance of Canadian poetry has been sustained later also by like Earl, we have Earl Birney or even Dorothy Livesey, P.K. Page, Irving Layton, and others, who first began in the 1930s and 1940s, but produced their best known works in the 1960s and 1970s. And the striking characteristics of the later part of the 20th century Canadian poetry will be discussed. Okay? I'll be discussing the characteristics. Okay, and when we look at the characteristics of Canadian poetry, the unbroken continuity and the brilliance of Canadian poetry has been sustained by, as I told you, Earl Birney, even Dorothy Livesey, or even P.K. Page, Irving Layton, and others also, who first began in the 1930s and 40s, but produced their best known works in the 1960s and 70s. So though they started writing the poetry in the 30s and 40s, so their works were well known in the 1960s and 70s. And the striking characteristics of the later part of the 20th century Canadian poetry can be understood in three terms. Okay, so we can understand the characteristics of the later part of the 20th century Canadian poetry in three major parts. First is that there has been a remarkable poetic upsurge, okay, which carried many trends of the modernist movement, including its tendency to be self-consciously anti-popular, okay, as even George Woodcock put it. He talked about self-consciously anti-popular poetry. So that's the one variety of characteristics of poetry. Now the second characteristics of contemporary modern poetry, Canadian poetry, is that we witness an extraordinary kind of, we can say, outburst, okay, outburst of poetry, okay, which has yielded amazing results. And between 1916 and 70s, not less than almost, as many as 590 poets published over 100 books of verse. Okay, leave aside the works which appeared in the anthologies and the magazines. Okay, thus what we witness is that the poetry in Canada has become the most significant form of artistic activity. So this has been known. Okay, and as it has been also known as the fashionable movement society. Okay, particularly the Canadian society has been called as the fashionable movement society, and poets, they became cultural heroes. Okay, okay, after they published their, I mean, poetic works, and their works were, I mean, concerning with fashionable society and other issues of the society. So they became cultural heroes. Okay, so that's the second, I mean, characteristic of contemporary Canadian poetry. Now, the third characteristics of the modern contemporary Canadian poetry is that the Canadian poetry being preoccupied with the happenings of the time, and it has been noticed that, I mean, it has been preoccupied with the happening, not only with the happening of the time, but also its culture and counter culture. So these poetries, okay, of contemporary time, deal with several issues, dealing with the society, I mean, they deal with, I mean, number of cultural patterns, okay, cultural practices, okay. They talk about counterculture activities, so many things. Moreover, this poetry also showed a deep involvement with the Canadian national identity, which is very, very important. Because they incorporated certain elements of national identity into their, I mean, poetic forms, and which should not be mistaken for the political issues. And liberation from the traditional and colonial goals also led to visualizing the realities of the colonial experience, even Canadian experience rather. Okay, so this is this is something which we witness in contemporary Canadian poetry: liberation from the traditional, from the colonial goals. Okay, and which really led to the visualization of the realities of Canadian experience. So these are the three characteristics of modern contemporary, Canadian poetry. Now, the result of these changes made poetry enjoy an unprecedented status in 1980, and it also attained an international repute because, as not of fire, put it, such a quantitative increase eventually makes for a qualitative change. So somehow we see this, both quantitative as well as qualitative changes, intermingling with each other. And even Northrop Frye's critical theories, promoted the use of mythologies and the use of also the myths, okay, as we witness it in James Rennie's, okay, writings, even J. Macpherson's writings, and Phyllis Webb's writings, Ellie Mandel's poetry also. So we see this, I mean, the use of mythology, the use of myths into their poetry, and there is a keen sense of locality, okay, as is noticed in the poetry of Robert Coates. Okay, so I mean, we find in that sense of locality. So people take the, I mean, local issues, okay, they pick up local issues and they talk about local issues in their poetry. So obviously we witness a sense of locality. They talk about the, I mean, particularity of the things, okay, of the local places, and they talk about Canada, and they don't talk about other countries, So all that happened to the land and its people shaped the worldview of the poets, okay, during contemporary Canadian time, I mean, contemporary Canadian poetry, time, So I mean, this is what we witness, okay, because whatever happened to the land and whatever happened to the people shaped the worldview of the poets, and also it helped to translate their almost visions of life, which they innovated, myths, okay, they made use of myths, symbols and images, okay, they overinterpreted, okay, the old ones, okay. So we witness this kind of things in the contemporary Canadian poetry. We have Canadian, I mean, well-known poet Nicole, even Mankada. Okay, so these people, they are known as innovatory poets. Okay, and they have well succeeded in creating resemblance, okay, between the content and form of a poem. So they are sort of creating kind of resemblance both. So they are incorporating both things, okay, intermingling both content as well as form of a poem. And Nicole particularly is considered to be a true surrealist poet of Canada. While Michael Ondaatje, okay, makes his poetry out of the absurd representation of actuality. So I mean, he picks up his poetry from absurd representation of actuality. So they are dealing with the actual life, and that is what we witness in both these poets, Nicole as well Michael Ondaatje. Okay, but there are poets who are so individualistic that they prefer to choose their own manner and style, mingling the traditions with innovations. And this is a unique kind of a feature which we witness in Canadian poets, mingling both the traditions, okay, with innovations, okay, and they create harmonious verse structures to convey their emotional diversities, which grow out of a compelling intermediary world of magic and dream. All these things happen. And we have a poet like Dennis Lee, who really rejects Canadian society because of its prevailing ills, and he becomes a political poet. So we also see some of the poets, becoming, political poets in the sense that, they are really fed up by the prevailing, ills of the society. And Dennis Lee happens to be one of those poets, who turned to be a political poet, Margaret Atwood, being an experimental poet, is fastidious in form and psychological and historical in thought. So he's fastidious in form as well as psychological and historical in thought. And he yes, yeah. So we talk about Margaret Atwood, and Canadian poetry tends to believe in William James's notion that reality keeps changing. Okay, so it talks about how reality keeps on changing, and that's the notion which was given by William James, okay, in his writings. And we also witness that it grows out of Canada's pluralistic society. And Canada is not only pluralistic society, but it also having mosaic culture, ensuring domestic values in the face of hostile nature, and it adheres to an authentic, indigenous system in the face of mobile appearances of multiple realities of here and now. So this is kind of thing which we witness in these contemporary poets. And now I'm also reminded of another Canadian poet whose name is David Stoke. Okay, and in his famous essay, which was entitled "The Canadian Imagination," David Stoke has succinctly, he observed that at the center of every imaginative response, buried however deeply, is a vision of human existence. So he is bringing this element, new element, a vision of human existence in his writings, okay, particularly in the essay which he wrote, which was entitled "The Canadian Imagination," where he is trying to, talk about, a vision of human existence, okay, and he focuses on that, But Canadian, imagination is different, as it is, obsessed with the limitations rather than the possibilities of human existence. So when David Stoke, okay, he talks about the vision of human existence, we find that there is a little bit, a kind of, differentiation, okay, which we find, with other poets, So Canadian imagination, which he's talking about, okay, he says, it is obsessed with the limitations, okay, rather than the possibilities of human existence. So David Stoke, therefore, he has, dealt with, a very different kind of, thematic consideration, a vision of human existence, And we also see that, it happens to be so, for two reasons, when we talk about David Stoke and talking about human existence, and he is doing that because of two specific reasons, okay. Number one reason is that, survival. He is doing for survival rather than the freedom. He says, he argues that survival rather than freedom is the great fact of Canadian life. And he is focusing on this, consideration, okay, how survival has become a very, very, important characteristic of Canadian life. Freedom, so survival and as well as freedom, both, So that's a number one point. 2 point, which happens to be the reasons why David Stoke is talking about human experiences. That he talks about looking holding on to what is known, or what is safe, okay, where he talks about, okay, preserving the values, you can, however, okay, humble they may be, okay, is at the center. And he says that, I mean, when you talk about preserving the value, it depends a lot on the center, because center is holding the floor. So, I mean, David Stoke, he argues that to preserve the values, okay, we need to, I mean, look at the center as well, because center, has control over everything, even the, I mean, the responsibility of preserving the values, okay. So, yeah. Now, if David Stoke, he leads the Canadian poetry. I mean, the image of, bleak landscape, to some extent we find, I mean, the description of bleak landscape also, okay, which is, very turbulent and very destructive, and then we find other poets also of the later period, okay, giving the images of small and humble abode, okay, which no doubt, promise a domestic security. And consequently, therefore, we also witness that the Canadian poets have the capacity to sing, okay, to sing with social content and social criticism also, to use, Munro's, okay, Munro Betty's words, okay, where Munro Betty is talking about capacity to sing, okay, for the people, for the social context, and also for social criticism, and they are, sincere in thought and emotion, and contemporary in technique and expression. So, I mean, these are the characteristics of some of the, Canadian poetry, of the later period, okay, just post David Stokes period, okay, where we see these kind of issues emerging in the writings of the poets. Now, Canadian poets, what we witness also during contemporary period is that, I mean, they try to find through poetry different ways of measuring the problems and its related feelings, saving it on the one hand, like intellectualism, they try to save it, okay, the whole notion of intellectualism, or on the other hand, okay, from sheer, inauthenticity. So they try to sort of, I mean, have this, I mean, focus on these both aspects, on intellectualism as well as, inauthenticity. So they really focus on these two elements, okay, of intellectualism as well as inauthenticity. I mean, they try to distinguish between these two and bring to the, fore of the people, actually look at these aspects, okay, which are being highlighted, okay, by this poet. Now we have another, Canadian poet whose name is Louis Dudek. He sums up the characteristics of Canadian poetry, stating that Canadian poetry is written out of inner necessity, okay, and is the proof rather of a predicament than a solution of the great questions in this or any other time, So he is focusing on the inner capacity when he's talking about Canadian poetry, particularly with reference to the contemporary Canadian poetry. Then Louis Dudek, okay, he's attaching the whole sentiment of, inner necessity, okay, it's like it's required, it's inner necessity, okay, out of which Canadian poetry is written. So Margaret Atwood, states that poetry is a lens, okay, that magnifies, even highlights the qualities of Canadian creative impulse and offers a pathway to an effective understanding of its life and surroundings. So Margaret Atwood is talking about a different kind of a lens, different kind of perspective, I mean, through which we need to look at the Canadian poetry. Particularly, I mean, Margaret Atwood is talking about, the whole Canadian creative impulse, okay, and how, it leads to a kind of pathway of an effective understanding of life and surroundings, and truly so, really does a nation reveal itself as much through poetry as Canada does. I mean, so I mean, Canadian poetry therefore uh, talks about, Canadian ethos, Canadian culture, okay, Canadian, characteristics, okay, which are involved there, and it has its unique experience also when we talk about Canadian poetry, okay, because I mean the whole nation is getting revealed through Canadian poetry, and so as stated earlier also, Canadian poets, being associated with several currently fashionable movements in society, have become its cultural heroes, and counter-cultural leaders also. Okay, so I mean they are being considered as cultural heroes, even counter-cultural heroes. So if they are finding that there are, I mean, some of the, elements of culture which needs to be focused into or incorporated into their, I mean, a poetic form, poetic works. They do that as well. Okay? They also talk about countercultural leaders. Okay, countercultural leaders. On the one hand, what we also witness is that they are the caretakers of collective truths. When we talk about Canadian poets, and particularly, I mean, when we find it in the writings of Margaret Atwood, so we find that, I mean, when she is, I mean, writing about, poetry and, I mean, culture and all, we also find in some of the writings of other poets as well. I mean, this whole collective, I mean, truth, okay, which are described, I mean, concerning the poets being the caretakers of the country, something that will really resist the oppression of race, oppression of gender, and oppression of class, So that is one side of it. On the other hand, uh, poets are also the source of strong intellectual as well as emotional content, they are considered to be the source of intellectualism, emotional content, and something which, I mean, enables them to be a civilizing influence on the people. Okay, because they do talk about, civilizing influence. Okay, into their writings. Okay, so people, the readers, when they go through the writings and they find this aspect, okay, all these, I mean, elements being present into their writings. Thus, the poets become a means of regeneration in the ever-changing society. Okay, and that is how they are known as cultural heroes. They become a means of regeneration. They regenerate things, you can say, I mean, which is considered to be a step forward for bringing transformation in the society, for ever-changing society. And they make poetry, carry the same aim as religion, myth, and science. So you can, well, I mean, see the kind of role which is assigned to the poetry, the poetry which really carries the aim as similar to, you can say, religion, myths, and sciences. Okay, so it has got immense role to play in the society. Okay, when we talk about the Canadian contemporary poetry. Now, in the 20th century, there is a general shift which we observe, in the 20th century, and the shift is from like a mere consciousness of a past to what is, valuable in the present. So they are going to the past and they sort of try to relate it with the present as well. So there has been a shift, okay, so which we observe in Canadian writings, particularly in the 20th century. Besides, the contemporary poets attempt to be mythical, as poetry offers them possibilities to be new by motivating them to take an excursion into the world of ideas, So they are, I mean, trying to attempt to be mythical, okay, because, what we find is that, I mean, their poetry, really offers people a lot of possibilities, okay, to enter into a new world of ideas. So they are motivating the readers, they are motivating the people to enter a new world of ideas, okay, which may be used to, I mean, further the, the transformation of the society. And we also observe that there is an attempt to create such poems, okay, in which ideas and arrangement of words on the page are made to show a tendency to present and preserve the essence of the new world in which the physical, is endowed with the spiritual substance. Okay, and hence the Canadian poets who are overpowered by the so-called, fear of an unknown world are haunted by the loneliness and chisel out their experiences into the bone essential statements. Okay, and they share a kind of a curious kind of an cultural anxiety which we find, into the writings. Okay, so though they are, overpowered by the whole notion of like fear, but they share a kind of a curious kind of a cultural anxiety, and which we witness into their writings also. Now, later Canadian poetry in general, and also particularly in nature poetry in particular, show a change in attitude that is of, mutualness. So we find this another element being present into the right mutualness. They talk about mutualness, and it has added like a very important three important characteristics to Canadian nature poetry. So when we talk about Canadian nature poetry, it's different from other forms of poetry. So there are three important characteristics to Canadian nature poetry. Let me talk about those three one by one. First, okay, kind of characteristics of Canadian nature poetry is that it shows a clear sight review of man's relation to nature and animals, leading to an all-pervading sense of mythic and historic unity, which is attached with mankind, to borrow the expression of Woodcock. So that's the first characteristics of Canadian nature poetry. Now the second kind of characteristics of Canadian nature poetry is that there is, we witness a haunting sense of love, okay, love for nation, okay. So haunting sense of love for nation, okay, in the best form of nationalistic sentiments, okay. For example, I take the poem of Milton Akron, okay, where he is carried away by the love for land, who states that Canada is the scent of pines, and okay, or even we have another poet like Gwendolyn McEwen, okay, whose poems okay reveal the complete identification with the nation's identity. So that is also witnessed in this Canadian poetry. And so much so are hearted also, okay, which is your body, which is the land, okay. So they talk about all these aspects. So these are the three characteristics, in two characteristics. Now the third characteristics of Canadian nature poetry is that there exists a direct knowledge of life which is gained through shrewd observations, which makes poets like Alden Nolan, Patrick Lane, and even Robert Kurowitz, okay, who take a vow not to sing other than our lives. So they talk about people's lives, the local people's lives, rather than talking about other people's lives, And these are the poets who have such a strong sense of locality. Okay, so we find this whole sense of locality being present into their poetic works, and so much so that they are also called the urban, regionalists or even the localists. Okay, so because of the elements of locality, because of the fact that they engage with the elements of locality. Okay, so they are called as the urban regionalists or even localists. Okay, localists. Now, apart from these three characteristics of nature poetry, we also witness that there are three important changes, okay, that have occurred over the decades in contemporary Canadian poetry. What are those three changes that have taken place in contemporary Canadian poetry? The first change which we witness in contemporary Canadian poetry is that language of the poems is the natural speech of the living people. So language, the focus is on language in the contemporary Canadian poetry. Now the second focus is on the identity and occupations of the poets themselves, okay, who have changed, okay. They don't have to belong to some form of intellectual aristocracy as such, And now the intent of Canadian poetry itself has changed. So theme, that is the third point. And the theme, okay, has changed in contemporary Canadian poetry. Now poetry also talks about today's world, as well as the things that are timeless, like love, death, and birth. Okay, and there has been a kind of a trend, okay, trend which has been common into and in contemporary poetic writings. So if you look at the thematic considerations, the themes which are being dealt with the contemporary writings, so you will find that they deal with like themes such as search for roots, interaction between mindscape and landscape. They talk about you can looking inward for interior landscapes, the personal becoming political and a political becoming personal. Okay, and they also talk about some of the nationalistic concerns, native concerns, uh, and also they deal with poetry written by women as well. We may also find other issues, okay, such as the weight of selfhood, the need for personal mythologies, the life in the prairies, landscape as a meaning, as a menacing presence, landscape, and the sense of wilderness. So all these forms, really all these various, themes, they form part of thematic strands in the recent contemporary Canadian poetry. So, these are the various kinds of, thematic considerations that we find in this, contemporary writing. If we go by the individual directions, okay, taken by the work of poets, okay, then in the in the 1960s and 70s, okay, then they've got some. There are a few people. So, like for example, we have Althworthy, Margaret Atwood, George Boring, Michael Ondaatje, even Robert Croce, okay, whose poetry, have really made a great impact on Canadian contemporary poetry, and the native voices also, and expatriate, voices. Okay, so these voices have added new dimension to, connected poetry of recent decades. So these are the characteristics that we find, about the contemporary Canadian poetry. So I hope today's lecture has helped you in understanding what we understand by contemporary Canadian poetry, and we've also known about the characteristics of the contemporary Canadian poetry. So that's it for today. Thank you so much.